The center of the church is changing, shifting to the southern hemisphere. And I think our brothers and sisters in the West are struggling. This is our time to stand up and take the gospel from everywhere to everywhere.
In 1910, the World Missionary Conference was held here in Edinburgh. It was held in the Assembly Hall of the United Free Church in the shadow of the Edinburgh Castle. It was a remarkable event. In fact, Mark Noll calls it the high tide of the Western missionary movement. The conference had 1,200 people, and it's very telling, the people that were at the conference. 80% of them actually came from Britain and North America, only 170 from Europe, and 18 from the rest of the world. Very few could have understood what the next 100 years would be like and the remarkable changes the world would see. As they gathered here in Edinburgh, there was a great sense of optimism of the future. And yet, in the next 100 years, we would see 2 world wars and numerous other conflicts. There was the sexual and social revolution of the 1960s. There were theological changes through that whole period of time. Added to that, you had the church moving from the global north to the south and moving from the west to the east. Mission was now going to become from everywhere to everywhere. And in the next 100 years, more Christians would lose their lives than any time before. It was a remarkable period that no one could have predicted.
The great missionary conference at Edinburgh in 1910 was, to that point in time, the world's most general gathering of Protestant Christian missions. The missionary historian Kenneth Scott Latourette called the 19th century the Great Century because the world population of Christians had gone from about 20% of the world to 30% of the world.
The 1910 conference was a desire to think hard and seriously and scientifically, as they put it, about the whole business of bringing the gospel of Jesus to the world. What were the issues? What were the challenges? What were the problems? Let's survey the whole world using the techniques of modern social science which we're developing and put our heads together and really seek to produce a concerted Protestant campaign for the evangelization of the world in this generation as they understood it. It was only Protestants. There were no Catholics, no Orthodox, no Pentecostals there either. So it was sort of mainline, more traditional Protestants getting together.
Looking back to try to harvest an informational conclusion about how missionary work had been going, looking back over the 19th century, which had seen remarkable, dramatic expansion of Christianity throughout the world. The irony has to do with the date, 1910, 4 years before the start of the First World War, and then the expectation that what had characterized the 19th century expansion of Christianity would characterize the century that followed 1910, which was anything, which is just not at all what happened.
They felt that the next century would see the triumph of Christianity on a broadly Western model, that Western missions were eventually going to sweep the board, particularly in Asia. They felt that the educated elites of Asia were on the brink of adopting Christianity because of its associations with Western education, Western modernity. On the other hand, they were a bit pessimistic about Africa because they felt that Africa was in danger of becoming an Islamic continent. In a sense, yeah, maybe they were right, but what they didn't actually foresee was the extent to which Christianity south of Africa, south of the Sahara, was actually going to become one of the most Christian parts of the world.
If we would take one of the people from that gathering and drop them into the Christian world of today, what would surprise them most, do you think?
Well, they were all white people. So they gathered together. Very few people from the rest of the world, most of the world were there. So it was basically an evangelization project from the West to the rest. Well, today, come to a global summit about global missions. It's dominated by the global South. And thank God for it, because we can learn from our sisters and brothers in Africa and South America and Asia and more. But that didn't happen then. So if you look at a chart from 1910 to 2010, the percentage of Christians in the world, it used to be they were all in the West and the North. Now they're in the South and diversified, really. But global Christianity is headquartered, actually probably somewhere in the west of Africa.
They would be delighted that Christianity has grown as much as it has. They might be more sober when they realize that actually, compared to world population, it's not grown. Christianity has not even kept pace with the expansion of population. As a male observer, they might well be surprised as to how strongly the women's presence and women's voice is now shaping many of the agendas in the world church. And I think they would be quite taken aback by how influential broadly Pentecostal strands of Christianity are, which in 1910 were very small, not yet really figuring on their radar and not being taken seriously.
Colonialism and mission goes right back to the early Christian centuries. Once the Emperor Constantine is converted, there is a kind of Roman Christian imperialism. Charlemagne was probably the greatest Christian imperialist of his day. The spring would come around and Charlemagne's armies would go into the field and come to a city and said, "You need to accept my rule and Christianity will kill you." It was a very effective missionary strategy. Not probably true to the character of Christianity, but a really effective strategy. And then, of course, with the expansion of Europe in the 19th and 20th century, we have modern colonialism, and Europe, North America, are the bearers of Christian faith.
How do you differentiate colonialism and mission?
Well, colonialism was the great scourge of missions. You go back 100 years ago, we lived in a colonial world. Africa was divided up by colonial powers. Much of the else of the world was as well. But the idea is that you would own this area. You could also exploit its natural resources. You would make it a better place, hopefully in some ways, though that generally didn't happen. Self-rule is so key to a people's attainment of who they are and what they want to do. So what happened is that at the same time the colonial era was, the great century of missions was.
It is true that at times during the 18th, 19th centuries, mission did tie up with colonialism, but that was at one point in history. You're talking about a 2,000-year-old movement. And to take one bit of mission from one part of the world and to typify the whole of mission in that way just doesn't work. Even if you look at modern mission, William Carey is often seen as the father of modern missions. He worked in Serampore in India, which was a Danish settlement, because the British East India Company wouldn't have him. The colonial authorities didn't want this missionary around. And, that's a sort of illustration that there was always tensions between the two. Yeah, there were times when missionaries worked too closely to the colonial authorities. You can't deny that. But you can't typify a 2,000-year-old movement just on that one thing.
Often the missionaries came kind of on the back of colonialism, and there are people today that talk about, well, mission is just Western colonialism. As an African, how do you see that?
For me, I think we have to have a balanced approach. Because in those days, they have no choice. What else can they do? I mean, the indigenous governments, they don't recognize them. They need help. They don't have guns and things that they will take care of themselves. They are people who are coming with the Bibles. And I think getting the protection of the colonialists, I think, was, for me, it was a necessity, not the choice. But despite of all that, they preached the gospel. Some of them went against colonialists.
The growth of African Christianity has mostly been since the mid-1900s and after the end of European colonialism. So there was a very strong African Christian movement before the end of colonialism. But once you took Western colonialism out of the picture, Africans were free to embrace Christianity in many different forms without being connected to the Western colonialists. So the growth has occurred since the end of colonialism.
We're in Battery Park. It's the lower end of Manhattan. Just over here is where the Staten Island Ferry leaves from. This statue is called The Immigrants. It was created by Luis Sangrino in 1973. In the middle 1980s, it was moved here to be next to Castle Clinton. Between 1855 and 1890, all the immigrants coming to America through New York came through Castle Clinton. That was 7 million people. New York now is a city of 8.6 million people. It is the most linguistically diverse city in the world. Over 800 different languages are spoken in this city. And yet, New York just represents all the large metropolitan cities of the world. People have come from every nation, culture, and country to be in the large metropolitan cities around the globe. Whether it's London or Paris, Madrid or Milan, Sydney or Singapore, the world has come to those cities. You know, in the past, missionaries used to get onto boats and planes to go to the ends of the earth. But now, the ends of the earth have come to our large cities. Going to the ends of the earth may mean simply crossing the street.
Back, of course, over 150 years ago, mission was from the west to the rest, I suppose. But now it is very much from everywhere to everyone. And you can just cross the street here today, Carl, and you will meet people from all of the nations. And we are receiving missionaries to the UK. We have people coming and ministering here in the UK, and they're being sent from churches in lands which used to be the receiving contexts of missionaries.
A lot of people were talking about the center of gravity in Christianity has moved to the south. And then the churches in the west is shrinking, and then there is explosive growth of Christianity, of global Christianity in the south. And then also we also saw that traditionally the West is the place or the source where missionaries were sent from. And now you are seeing that different places, different parts of the world, they are sending missionaries to the West.
What is happening is there's a spiritual vacuum which is being filled not by Christianity per se, but by other expressions of spirituality, New Ageism, interest in Eastern religions, and so forth. But at the same time, the immigration patterns have shaped the landscape, the religious landscape of the West. That many Western countries speak about the growth of Christianity not within the long-term populations there, but amongst the African immigrants, Asian immigrants, Latin American immigrants going into Europe and North America. And so Christianity is being reinfused in a different way through these immigrant populations.
The center of the church is changing, shifting to the southern hemisphere. Nowadays, in a global age, the world is coming to be the same village, and yet there are pockets where for one or other reason are ignored or neglected.
I think increasingly a lot of people from the majority world or global south see Europe as a mission field, whereas before no one sees Europe as a mission field. It's kind of like, no, we send missionaries, not the other way around. But now UK is receiving a lot of missionaries, and people have been coming since the 60s, and this is why it's actually interesting that it's not necessarily a new phenomenon, but since the 90s there's been attention drawn to it. There are others things that people are doing, coming from different places, whether it's Central Asia or South Asia, coming to the UK as missionaries, coming as pastors.
Places that are yet to be evangelized because of the war on terror has become a no-go area for the traditional missionary who would have come from America or Europe. But then the African has that easy access to go to these places and to do work there. And the churches in Europe that are sleeping.
The church in Ethiopia is nowadays, especially for the last 4 or 5 years, their vision is becoming very big. Now, even my own denomination have sent a number of missionaries all over the world, to India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, to Chad in Africa. So we have quite a lot of missionaries worldwide. The churches are highly revived in terms of sending out. You know, the growth in the global south, the church growth is amazing. So it's a time for the global south to send out missionaries.
Do you feel that sense that this is Africa's time, this is Ethiopia's time? Is that
It is. Now, for example, one of the things people ask me, how do people support missionaries? I mean, now we have a thing where every month people, besides their tithes and gifts, committed 100 birr that goes directly to the missionaries. So I think it is possible to support. I mean, we shouldn't expect the church to be wealthy and have many things, but it is where your heart is.
That 100 birr would still be quite a sacrifice, because
exactly
Ethiopians don't exactly make a lot of money, do they?
No. It is a sacrifice.
Yeah.
Because it is how you prioritize your life matters.
Yeah.
That is why people sacrifice and say, I am saved because someone preached the gospel to me. Like my story. What would have happened if that lady probably decided, no, maybe, I'm just a new believer. Why should I talk about Jesus? Probably I wouldn't be here. But because she stepped out,
yes,
and she shared what little she knew about Christ, I'm here standing and speaking about the grace and the gift of God.
It says in Revelation 7, the last book of the New Testament, that there'll be men and women from every tongue, tribe, and nation. When you're in heaven forever, you can still be identified from where you came from. So there's something about that God designs and desires His eternal worship to be made up of every tongue, tribe, and nation. Right now, every tongue, tribe, and nation won't be present around the throne forever because they have not heard the good news of the gospel.
The ends of the earth is Jesus' way of saying no one is exempt. This is meant for everyone. Why should anyone on this planet suffer without the beauty and the freedom of these ideas. It's not right. If you've been given a gift and you know that there are people who don't have that, if you care about those people, you'd want to share it with them.
When you know that Jesus loves you and your sins are forgiven, you can't help but share it. And so whether that means that you go to another country, or you learn another language, or you're just talking to your neighbor over the fence in the backyard, there's something compelling about the story that makes you want to share it.
Sometimes we believe that the true missionary activity is not to find people who've never heard of Christ, but to go to the places where people have known and forgotten or have no use for the gospel. And often that's even in our own neighborhoods or back in our own communities.
For me, it's breaks barriers. And we tend to stay in the very comfort zone. There's a lot of problems, a lot of hurting people outside church and outside our comfort zone.
If you think about the spread of the Christian faith, it has to spread horizontally from place to place, but it also has to reach across generations. And in every generation, people reframe Christianity according to their own culture. The Christianity of my parents is not the same Christianity as that of my children. So one way of thinking of going to the ends of the earth is a deliberate work to bridge generations.
The ends of the earth for most people is right across the kitchen table. How are we going to speak our message to these populations that they just don't want to know, because they're raised in a very different culture, and to me that is going to be the challenge of our time.
Is to be understood not simply geographically, but perhaps in social, cultural and economic terms.
They don't have to be away from us, but they may be very near geographically, but they are still minority people groups, and they feel neglected.
Traditional paradigm of missions being out there somewhere needs to be broken down, and we need to realize that actually missions begins on our very doorstep, which actually is very exciting because we can mobilize the whole church. I mean, back in Hudson Taylor's day, it was only the few that could go to China, whereas now God has brought China to England, so everybody actually can be involved in missions right on our very doorstep.
Not to forget, about those people who do not enjoy this freedom. We live in freedom, but we cannot just enjoy it and forget about those who do not have this freedom.
It starts and it finishes with Him. There is nothing other than the name of Jesus that is to be held above everything. He offers hope and salvation to people. We're seeing people come to faith in Him and lose everything because of it, but find joy.
I still think there's a really important line between faith and unbelief. And crossing that boundary is still a boundary I think Jesus invites all of us to be part of. And taking that good news into new territory in that sense is critical.
It is all about people. It's not about the globe. It's not about the geography. It is all about a person who lives in a very remote, or it could be even at the middle of a town, when he listens the gospel in a language that he understands best. The end of the world has started. It's not completed yet, but it started there.
Well, for me personally, if what Jesus says is true and what the scriptures say about Jesus is true, it changes everything. Because it means that there is a God who cares enough about me and about everyone that He was willing to die. It means that at the heart of the universe is love. It also means that the universe isn't about me. So, like my ego, whether something good or bad happens to me doesn't really matter that much. My job is to love. And my job is to do the best work that I can do on something that I would do that someone else wouldn't. And then I have to let the results be in God's hands.